All right, today we are looking at, and good morning, by the way, ladies and gentlemen. Today we are looking at the third agricultural revolution, also known as the Green Revolution. Um, and it's basically it's the recently successful development of higher yield, fast growing varieties of food with its principal focus on the development of what we call GMOs, or genetically modified organisms. So, first agricultural revolution, birth of farming. Second agricultural revolution, industrialization of farming. And third agricultural revolution, now pretty much scientific application of farming. Now, the Green Revolution involves two main practices. One is the introduction of higher yield seeds and the expanded use of fertilizers is the second. Mainly fertilizers made from nitrogen, from phosphorus, from potassium, basically like synthetic grade fertilizers. So the first agricultural revolution takes us back to about 10,000 years ago, right? The second agricultural revolution takes us back to early 1700s, really throughout the Industrial Revolution. The third agricultural revolution takes us back now to around the 1930s when it first launches, and we're still living in it now. But around the 1930s, a group of agricultural scientists in the United States and in the American Midwest began experimenting with technologically manipulated seed varieties of wheat to increase crop yields, was the idea. The effort was to make this miracle wheat seed that grows faster, that grows, with much resistance to pests, and that you could actually get a higher yield out of as well. So that was the idea. In the 1940s, American philanthropists are funding research on corn production in Mexico, also looking to find a hybrid seed that would grow better. And in fact, by the 1960s, they had one to the point where Mexico no longer had to import corn. It was growing so well. In the 1950s, a miracle wheat seed was finally created here in the United States by this gentleman here. This is Norman Borlaug, who actually won a Nobel Peace Prize in 1970 because of the contributions of this miracle wheat seed to basically global security. In the 1960s, the focus shifts to India as scientists work to cross varieties of rice to produce rice grains that were larger and stronger than rice naturally found. Basically, what they were doing was crossing a Chinese variety with an Indonesian variety and producing a rice grain that we call IR8. As a result of IR8, we have a surplus of rice by 1971. By 1982, we have probably the most popular rice grain of all time, known as IR36, that achieved genetic resistance against 15 pests, a growing cycle of 110 days, making basically, if you do the math, 3 harvests a year possible. And it's the most popular rice in the world by 1992. And then we continue developing even more productive rice from there. In the 1990s, new high yield wheat and corn produced in the United States is using a very similar process. We have arrived in the era of GMOs, basically. So as a result of that, now in 2020, famines only really are produced as a result of political problems, not actual food shortages. Realistically speaking, there is enough food on the planet Earth to feed every single human being 3 meals a day. Any food shortage issues, any malnutrition issues is as a result of distribution, not actual like lacking of the resource. So there it is. India became completely self-sufficient in grain by the 1980s. Also, keep in mind that we're not just talking about GMOs here when we're talking about the Green Revolution, but part of the Green Revolution is also dealing with the use of fertilizers, the use of pesticides, irrigation in some places, etc. Now, so far, this is a pretty happy topic, but there are some problems. For one thing, one of the big criticisms of the Green Revolution is it doesn't really help out an area that deals with food distribution areas a lot, and that is much of sub-Saharan Africa. And it doesn't help out sub-Saharan Africa much because it's the diet in sub-Saharan Africa, or the various diets that you find in sub-Saharan Africa, are not really based around corn or wheat or rice, which is what we've typically worked with in the Green Revolution. However, we are working to try similar methods with cassava, with sorghum. Plus, part of the Green Revolution is fattening livestock faster, so that can be done in sub-Saharan Africa, and a super rice yield that can yield twice as much per acre than current rice can be attractive when it does arrive. So there are some upsides. There are some possible upsides. The other issue here, and you got to think about kind of global connectivity here, is that GMOs are largely frowned upon in Europe, though they get much of their I'm trying to figure out how I want to explain this. The United States is very, very tied to Latin America when it comes to like food exports. And so what Latin America is to the US is essentially what Africa is to Europe. So with GMOs largely being frowned upon in Europe and there not being like a huge market for them, this is Africa's biggest export market. So Africa, it really is limited in how much it can get into the GMO game, the Green Revolution game, because if they get into it full scale, then how is that going to affect its exports to Europe, which it heavily relies on for financially? Many also question whether gene manipulation could create health risks and produce environmental hazards, such as organic matter in the soil and groundwater pollution, or I should say reduced organic matter in the soil and groundwater pollution. There's also a fear that the creation of disease-resistant plants could lead to the evolution of superpests. That's always a topic. Also, the large-scale monocropping that's often part of the Green Revolution and Green Revolution agriculture can make farms very, very vulnerable to changes in climate and infestation and particular pests. I guess we haven't really used the term monocropping once, or haven't really used it much, but the idea of monocropping is basically planting one crop. I mean, that's your sole crop. That's usually what we're going to see. Like if you've got a pineapple plantation, that's what you're growing there is pineapple. You're not really growing anything else. You're monocropping. And so, again, that can make farms very vulnerable to changes in climate or infestation of particular pests, because if one pest hits your crop, you're done. You have nothing else to fall back on. It's oftentimes said that the real beneficiaries of the Green Revolution have really been the agrochemical industry, large petrochemical companies, manufacturers of agricultural machinery, dam builders, large landowners, as many small-scale farmers basically lack the resources to acquire genetically enhanced seeds. And the necessary fertilizers and pesticides, and therefore are being driven off their lands because they really just can't compete. And so for many small farmers, the Green Revolution has actually led to an increase in poverty, which is interesting. The bottom line is that a few large corporations with the seed patents for genetically modified grains and a virtual monopoly of the needed chemical inputs can have tremendous power over the agricultural production process and hurt small farmers because, again, they just simply can't afford to participate. So kind of the final thing we want to look here is at some of like the sweeping changes that we have seen as a result of the third agricultural revolution, um, specifically the Green Revolution, right? Genetically modified organisms are literally this picture is a joke, by the way. It's not real. Genetically modified organisms are literally found in about 75% of all processed food in the United States. If you're eating processed food, which you probably are, then you also are essentially consuming food that has been genetically modified. 88% of all corn in the United States is genetically modified. That's up from only 25% back in the year 2000. 94% of all acres of soybean in the United States is genetically modified. And that's not necessarily a good thing. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's certainly a thing. And while some regions of the world have embraced GMOs, like the United States, other regions have literally banned them, and poorer countries just don't really have the access to the technology. Western Europe, for example, has resisted GMOs, although agricultural officials have deemed GMOs to be safe. The public has continued concerns in Europe about health and taste of product. And then, as far as sub-Saharan Africa is concerned, a fear generally exists of U.S. corporations like Monsanto, for example, who manufacture most of the GMO seeds. Well, why the fear? The fear is that they could and would introduce a so-called terminator gene into genetically modified seeds that would prevent farmers from being able to replant them after harvest. Essentially, a terminator gene in a seed would mean that the seed that comes out of the fruit or vegetable that you're planting, you would not be able to plant those seeds. They just wouldn't work, which would force you to have to buy more seeds from a corporation like Monsanto year after year, and basically kind of bring farmers into this kind of dependent relationship with large transnational agricultural corporations. So that's the overall fear. That's what we're looking at here. Yeah, so the pros and cons of the Green Revolution for sure, right? The third agricultural revolution. Well, tomorrow, guys, is a catch-up day for you all, and then I'll see you back in line online on Friday. So have a good, or sorry, excuse me. Tomorrow's a catch-up day. Tomorrow is Friday. So if you've got catching up to do in any classes, including mine, tomorrow's your day to do it, and then I'll see you back online on Monday.